event will be recorded. And it will be available afterwards by tomorrow sometime on our website if you'd like to take another look at it or to share it with someone. Also, Alex's new book, which is called My Place at the Table, is of course for sale at bookstore number 1. And if you look in your chat, at the very top of the chat function, you will find a link to purchase the book from us. And it doesn't matter if you're not in town, we can send it to you. No worries. Also, I have brought in all of you on mute, and that's really just to not have a lot of extraneous noise in the background as the dog barks and the UPS guy comes to the door and etc. And we may very well unmute you for the Q&A at the end. It depends on how many people we have on the call. So you are muted for a purpose. In any case, I'd like to ask you to put your questions in the chat function because we'll have it there. So even if we still need to remain muted, we'll have the questions with us. All right, I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening. He's Alexander Lobrano. He grew up in Connecticut and lived in Boston, New York, and London before moving to Paris in 1986, and that's his home today. And I'm happy to say that he is a part-time Sarasota resident. He was European correspondent for Gourmet magazine from 1999 until it closed in 2009, and has written about food and travel for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, Saveur, Travel and Leisure, and many other publications in the United States and the United Kingdom. He is the author of Hungry for Paris, the ultimate guide to the city's 110 best restaurants, and is a contributing editor at Saveur magazine. His second book, Hungry for France, was published in April 2014. He has won several James Beard Awards and was awarded the International Association of Culinary Professionals Bert Green Award for culinary writing for his article, Spirit of the Bistro in Saveur magazine. Please welcome Alec Lebrano.
Thank you very much, Georgia. I'm delighted to be here tonight. And before all else, I'd like to thank, let's see, I hope that there we are. Before all else tonight, I would like to thank Sarasota and Sarasotans for their help in writing my book, because as Georgia mentioned, I am a part-time Sarasota resident. I had been coming to Sarasota on vacation for years after when I was with friends from Los Angeles. Love to come to Sarasota for the beaches. And because it was sort of halfway between Europe and California, we would meet here. And eventually we decided, or I decided with my French spouse, Bruno, that we wanted to have an American footprint. And as Georgia mentioned, I've lived in New York and Boston and other places up north. I decided that it would be nice to write a new chapter in our lives, one that we wrote together. And so we bought a place in Sarasota, and it is where I come to clear my mind and close the door and turn on my computer and actually get to work. I work really well here. It's a wonderful, wonderful town. And it's also a place that there are as many temptations almost in terms of good food in Sarasota these days as there are in France, which might sound sort of preposterous, but actually it's not. One of the things that's interesting in the world today is that I think the enormous gap that existed between America and France when I first moved to France in 1986 has narrowed considerably. We eat really well in the US now. And if there are reflections of this everywhere, there are reflections of the interest of people, Americans, in food, a sincere, informed interest in food. You see it in Sarasota with in the farmers market. where they're fantastic. There are all sorts of fantastic things to buy and eat and cook. And shops like Artisan Cheese Company with my friend Louise, um, who was one of the people who sort of lured us into deciding to really spend full time or more time here. Thanks to Louise, I discovered that here I am living in the country that's most famous for cheese in the entire world. Little did I know that there was an American cheese renaissance going on. And every time I come, I am gratified and proud because I'm still American, even if I've lived out of the country for 37 years. I'm not an expat. I'm an American who chose to live abroad because I'm just insatiably curious and I love to travel. And so I love peering into the cases at Artisan Cheese Company because there's always something new. Coming from the Northeast, the traditional cheese belts were Vermont, upstate New York, Wisconsin, places like that. Today, there are beautiful, beautiful, beautiful raw milk cheeses being made in Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, Texas, all over the place. They're beautiful. They're absolutely gorgeous. So I am not here to talk to you tonight from an on-high position, far from it, actually. We've been here for almost 2 months now. It's the first time I've been back in the US in a year and a half, which was a very powerful experience. We flew through New York City, and just landing here, I realized that I really missed the country in which I've been born. And I'd also miss Sarasota. So that's why I am extremely pleased to be with you tonight. And I thank Georgia, Georgia Court and Andrea Ginsky for arranging this event. My book, I was thinking about it because last night, new friends in Lido Shores said to me, well, Alec, you could write about lots of subjects. Why did you decide to write about food? And I thought, my late father must be floating somewhere in the room because the number of times that he asked me that question, where he would say with sort of a furrowed brow, well, I think you're a very good writer, but why food? I mean, really, truly. And I'd say, well, actually, it's been the lens through which I've seen the world ever since I was a little boy. I was extremely bookish. I always had a book in my, I was always sitting in an apple tree reading a book. Extremely bookish and also passionate about eating and food, because for me, I think that food was almost a language. I speak English, French, Italian, German, and food. And I think I speak food better than, I'd like to say that I speak food better than any other language. Because food is edible poetry. And restaurants are like small theaters. And I think that more today than ever before, restaurants are the venues where so much of life is lived. And I know, speaking of what it was like for us to have gone through the COVID experience in France, how desperately we missed them. We missed them at first because when they shut down very abruptly in March 2020, everything was shut down overnight, and it was shut down, lock, stock, and barrel until May. I missed, of course, I missed the food, and I missed my friends who are chefs in Paris, and I missed the gastronomic landscape, and I missed the open markets, and I missed all the things that seduced me about the city when I first visited as a 13-year-old boy. But I think what I missed most of all and understood most of all was that the richness and the it's absolutely fascinating to cast yourself into a play, and that's sort of what happens. Every service in a restaurant is sort of like a play, and every person who's dining there is playing a part, whether they're aware of it or not. And just listen to the soundtrack of a restaurant, people laughing, the sound of cutlery on plates. It's a small microcosm of the entire world. And for me, I've been lucky enough to travel a great deal in my life, and restaurants have always been the most immediate way for me to approach a culture, especially if I'm at a place that I don't speak the language. People invariably respond warmly and generously when you indicate an interest in their food. It is the thing that we share. It's the thing that differentiates us in the most wonderful ways. And so, yes, that's why I'm so interested by food. I just feel that it is, and food is also, and this goes back to Georgia mentioned, I was the Ruth Reichel's man in Paris for a decade, which was a glorious experience. And I don't think very many people will have that luck in the future because Ruth, who's a very, very brilliant woman and a very exigent editor, said to me when we had lunch in New York and she offered me the job, she said, you know, Alec, I don't want you just to be trilling about how delicious something is. I want you to understand and experience food in the 360-degree way. Food is political. Food is scientific. Food, it affects the environment. Food is part of the economy. I want you to build this into the way that you perceive of food and the way that you write about food. This is extremely important to me. And that's what we did during those 10 wonderful years at Gourmet. We tried to reboot the idiom of food writing away from something that kind of spun on an axis of Francophile, Francophone privilege towards something that was more inclusive. I'm very proud of what we did. And this is the work that I'm still most so passionate about. I mean, again, last night with these lovely new friends in Lido Shores, I was talking about how I'm so aware of the fact that if I do a profile of a young chef in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or some other widely read publication, I am so happy to be able to bring that person to greater attention. And I take it extremely seriously because I want people to understand what he or she is actually doing, what their perspective is on food. It is not just it's not a superficial subject, far from it. It's a vital, extremely important subject. And I have honed this craft over a very long period of time. And that's why, for example, last weekend in the Wall Street Journal, I profiled a chef who's just opened a restaurant in Nîmes, near where I have a house in the south of France. And she was fascinating. I wasn't able to talk to her before I left Paris. So we Zoomed, which seems to be our new way of life. But her name is Georgia Viu, and she's from Benin and in West Africa. And her new restaurant, she lives in Marseille, which, by the way, because I think everybody likes a little bit of food tips here and there, if you happen to be heading to France later in the year, I think Marseille is actually the most interesting food city in France right now. But we had a long, very interesting conversation about how African foods and African seasonings and the African palate is, of course, very deeply built into American cooking, which we've also seen recently in the Netflix documentary High on the Hog. And if you haven't watched High on the Hog, I highly recommend it. And so for me, it was wonderful to bring Georgiana Viu to greater attention and to acknowledge the fact that she not only mastered Beninoise cooking, the cooking of her own country, but the cooking of Marseille, which is a kind of a brawny place that, I mean, seeing this nice lady from Benin, I can just imagine Georgiana insists that she makes the world's best bouillabaisse. I'd love to try it. I hope I will when I get back to France, but I can just imagine the Marseillaise reacting to her boast. All of which is to say that I am extremely passionate about what I do, and it continues to be my prism. But I decided to write this book, which is another question that I'm often asked: why now, and what does this actually mean? I sort of pushed back against the idea of it being described as a memoir. What I realized was a lot of things changed. There were deaths, and the world is changing very rapidly in terms of media, in terms of the way that we cook and think about food. And I thought I have done a huge trip, sort of like, my own personal odyssey is complete. I was also, in addition to working for um, the American and British food magazines and writing about food for England and the US, I was the food critic for the French equivalent, or the French equivalent of the Wall Street Journal for a while. So I, as an American, was writing about French food to the French and writing in French. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. I was gobsmacked when I was offered the job. Um, and when I told French friends about it, and they looked kind of alarmed, they said, well, what did you say? And I said, well, I accepted the job. And they said, Alec, every doorway you're going to step out, when you step out the door of the building where you live in Paris, make sure, look both ways, because you've just landed one of the best food writing jobs in France. The envy, and this is going to bring on the normal litany of, well, what, this is nonsense. What can an American really truly know about French food? You could never have the authority to tell us anything about our own cooking. I'd like to think that my perspective brought something different to the conversation that the French have among themselves about their own cooking. And in the early articles that I wrote, I started very humbly, because I think humble is always a good thing in a loud, noisy world we live in. So I wanted people to know who I was. And I explained that I had grown up with a bipolar gastronomic background. My mother was from Boston, and my father's family is from New Orleans. You might guess which side of the family the gastronomic passion originated in. That being said, Boston has turned into a very good food city. But when I was a child, and we would go to my grandmother's house for lunch in Boston, I have two brothers and a sister, and we would dread what we described as another white meal, because my grandmother ate because you had to eat to nourish yourself and be healthy. There was no element of pleasure at the table, and the table was well set, and she was a well-heeled woman who could employed a Nova Scotian cook. But the white meals meant cauliflower, rice, and cod on a white plate with nothing else, or chicken and potatoes, and there was the white meals. And it was a source of hilarity to us, because one day I actually said to my grandmother, I'm the eldest of the four, it was a May day, and we're looking at the windows, and the radiators are hissing in Boston, and she's got the windows shut tight as drums, and you can see the lilac tumbling in the garden in the back. And I said, Grandmother, would it be possible to have some mustard or some Worcestershire sauce, or don't know, I mean, something, just some, or ketchup, or, and she, without looking up, you can almost hear her neck crack. Without looking up, she said, first of all, children do not speak until they're spoken to. And second of all, children should never eat condiments, because condiments excite children. So now when I see my sister with a ketchup bottle at a barbecue, I always say, you better be careful. That was one side of the family. The other side of the family was the mirthful side, the joyous side, the New Orleans side, where all anybody talked about was what they were going to eat at dinner. You talked about what you're going to have for lunch the next day, and lunch the next day, you talked about what you're going to have for dinner. And when I would go down and spend time in New Orleans as a little kid with my brother, there too, I had two great aunts who lived together, unmarried, in a house in the French Quarter. And they also had an amazing cook, an Afro-American lady named Emma, and she would take us to the market with her. And she taught me more about food than anybody else I think I've ever met. And again, to reprise what I was saying before about the influence of African cooking on, and Afro-American foodways on American food, and French food for that matter, it's enormous. I really think that's where it starts. I mean, there were immigrant groups for all kinds of different culinary traditions to the US. But the real, if you really open up the back of the clock and James Beard recipes and Fannie Farmer recipes, and a lot of those recipes, a lot of those things were cooked by Afro-Americans. And are the ballast of American, real, true, bona fide American gastronomy, with the exception of contributions made by other people like the Amish and other people, is profoundly Afro-American. But the New Orleans, it was in New Orleans also that conviviality, I mean, the conviviality of everything. And so I grew up fascinated by food. And then finally, my mother, who's an art historian and a very cerebral, reserved woman, took me and my two brothers to Europe for the summer, or the summer after she had unexpectedly inherited some money. And we began in Rome. We were going to be there for 6 weeks. And after about a week, there was, she turned to me at one point and she said rather waspishly, "Do you know, Alec, food is an ephemeral pleasure. The pleasure of Bernini and the pleasure of Caravaggio is eternal. The pleasure of food is, well, you have a nice meal and you leave the table and that's that." Because she had perceived that I was much more interested by what we're eating than it wasn't that I was indifferent to the beauties of the Vatican or any place else that we went to, but I was bowled over by the food. And then my epiphany occurred, of course, when we arrived in Paris. And I knew after the 5 days that we spent in Paris, tears welling up as the train pulled out of the station to go to Calais and cross the channel on a boat. I thought to myself, I don't know what I'll do, but I will have to find some way to get back there. And it took me a long time to do so, but I did. I worked in book publishing in New York City, and then I got a job working for a newspaper in London. And then eventually I heard of a job opening in Paris. Talk about improbable casting, but as an editor in the Paris office of Women's Wear Daily, Fairchild Publications as it was then known. And I applied, and rather improbably, because I knew nothing about fashion, I was hired by the late John Fairchild, who was a real ogre of a man. And at the end of our interview, I looked up after he'd offered me the job, and I said, Mr. Fairchild, I blurted out, I said, I feel I really should tell you, I don't know anything about fashion. And he nodded, pursed lips, smiled. And he said, well, I could tell that when you walked in here. And I thought, okay. And then he said, and Alec, no worries. If this doesn't work out, that's easy. I'll fire you. So I worked writing about fashion, but whenever there was a food subject, and they came up occasionally because W magazine, glossy magazine, used to occasionally do food subjects. And my first story that I wrote for them was actually a story about a famous cheese merchant in France. And I was assigned this story the night before I went to the interview. My French was, I thought, pretty good, but it was pretty good as an occasional tourist, not French that was up to a level of actually being lived in every day. I went to interview this cheese merchant and accompanied by a photographer. And I'd written all my cards, or my questions out on index cards. And the first index card, which I translated with a dictionary, the first index card, I said to him, bonjour, Monsieur André. I am, so pleased to meet you and so nice to be back in your shop, which I've first visited with my family 5 years ago. I will ask you no questions. Please consider me to be your student of cheese and tell me all about your beautiful cheeses. And he looked a bit alarmed, but he was a very, very nice man. And so we put on big felt slippers, which were to protect us, prevent us from tracking bacteria down into the cheese aging cellars, which were gouged into the limestone under the shop. This was behind the Gare Saint-Lazare in the heart of Paris, for people who know Paris. And we spent the next 90 minutes down in the cheese cellars with him. I mean, his, telling me the story of every cheese in the place. And my French went from bad to worse to hysterical. And I'm pretending to take notes, even though I barely understood, an eighth of what he was saying. I did understand vache, which means cow, and chèvre, which means goat. So there I kind of assumed he was talking about cow's milk cheese or goat's milk cheese. The breakthrough moment was when he said brebis, and suddenly I thought, what is that? Oh, you, a female sheep. And more dim-witted than I've probably ever been in my life, I thought, well, I wonder if you could make cheese from sheep's milk. And as if he was reading my mind, he patted a huge wheel of Roquefort and said to me, I want you to try some of this. So that was the answer to that question. But in any event, after 90 minutes down there and the photographer rolling his eyes and my trying to indicate enthusiasm for what was going on, but saying things that were utterly preposterous, we went back upstairs and we had a cheese tasting. And when we left, I said to him, I wanted to pay him a compliment. So I said to him, Monsieur Antoulet, your cheeses are so beautiful. I thought I was saying, your cheese is so beautiful that they should be smashed on the walls of the Louvre Museum. What I intended to say was your cheeses are so beautiful, they should be hung on the walls of the Louvre Museum. But what I said was your cheeses are so beautiful, they should be smashed on the wall of the museum. Again, he had a perplexed expression on his face, but he was polite and kind. The photographer is groaning and rolling his eyes and everything else. Anyway, and the cab back to the office, Patrick, the photographer, said, Alec, you're a train wreck. Your French is, I can't even, and you had better get a grip because otherwise you should pack your bags and see if you can get your job back in London. But I don't know how I learned French. Sometimes I think that when we're in over our heads in life, it's, times of high adrenaline when you challenge yourself to go beyond your immediate competences. Are actually great times of great gifts because I learned French, but I was also learning French food because the French way of eating and thinking about food and cooking is so very different from the American way. When I first went, for example, to a shop to buy potatoes, I said that I wanted some potatoes, but there were about 20 different kinds of potatoes. And the man, the shopkeeper said, well, what are you cooking? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe a roast chicken. And he said, well, if you like the taste of almonds, you might like these. And if you like the taste of and he's explaining all these different varieties of potatoes when I thought, gosh, I wish my mother was here because we knew Idaho, Maine, and those little red ones that you use to make, potatoes and potato salad during the summer. So I began my learning curve there. I've been lucky enough not only to have worked for Gourmet, but I've also been lucky enough to have spent hours with some of the greatest chefs in the world who were allowed me to be their student. I've spent hours in cooking schools and markets and with cheese producers and fishermen. And I've been to every corner of France. I probably know France more intimately and much better than I do the United States because I constantly, when I come back to the US, I think to myself, people from the Northeast are so hopelessly provincial, which is another reason why I'm so glad that I'm spending time in Sarasota because it gives me a new perspective on America. But in any event, I know French food and French cooking intimately, and that's why I was very, very, very honored and flattered that when Houghton Mifflin in New York, the publisher of my book, we were looking to have people comment on the book in advance of publication. And Alain Ducasse, who's probably, arguably the best known French chef in the world today since Paul Bocuse passed away, instantly said that he would love to write a little blurb for my book. And about a week after I get back to France, I'm going to his new restaurant, which is in a new hotel, which is just opened at the Chateau de Versailles. And I don't think I need to tell you how much I'm looking forward to that. Um, I have, and I think this is true for all of us actually, as I said, I love to cook. Um, but I have cooked so much, and I think we've all cooked so much. And I think that I'm more grateful for the work of chefs and culinary professionals than I've ever been in my entire life. What a pleasure it is to actually open the door and go into a restaurant and eat somebody else's cooking, and to encounter flavor palettes that I would never have thought of. And it's Sarah, from that point of view also, Sarasota is such a fascinating place because the gastronomic landscape here is so unbelievably cosmopolitan and rich, with every Central American and South American cuisine represented, many Asian cuisines, and it was a new Uzbeki restaurant. Um, you would never find a city of 56,000 in France with such a diverse gastronomic offer. And this is another reason why, when I was working as the food writer for Les Echos, the French equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, I explained to people, I was on television a lot, and I said, we grow up, somebody said to me, well, explain to me what the American palate is and what it means. And I said, well, we grow up eating so many foods from so many different countries and so many different cultures. It's like a piano keyboard. They've eaten Thai food. I mean, you go into any American grocery store, you go into Publix and you can find fresh lemongrass. That's not true in France. I said, we are receptive, we're curious. We we create things like Korean tacos. We create all sorts of things in the United States. I said, we're not hidebound. There are things that could be improved in the US, but I said, the French think of us as being um, eating nothing but cheeseburgers and milkshakes and, Hollywood food. They've had a lot of trouble wrapping their brains around the fact that America has become an avidly gastronomic country with some really brilliant chefs. I think what's helped a lot is that there's some extremely good American chefs working in Paris right now. Notably, Braden Perkins at a restaurant which is called Verjus in the Palais Royal. And Braden was born in Boston, grew up in New Orleans, and worked in Seattle before moving to Paris. And the other one is Daniel Rose, who's from Chicago. And Daniel lived in Paris for 15 years and now has two bistros in Paris and what I think is the best French restaurant in New York City, which is called Le Coucou. We're showing the world that that America is a deeply evolved and deeply delicious place. And this is important because I also think it to be a form of diplomacy. And, I also believe that that the language of food, what we're sharing together, is deeper and richer than it's ever been in human history. And I think that's also why another question people ask me all the time is, there's a schadenfreude, or the desire to see, an idol smashing, somebody fall off their pedestal. A lot of people have wanted to tear France off of the pedestal of being the gastronomic arbiter of the Western world. So people often say to me, well, Alec, what do you think? And I say, well, I think that the food landscape today isn't a pyramid anymore with France at the top. It's more horizontal. But I think that France is still the ballast of Western culinary tradition. Every country that comes along and makes a run for notoriety, whether it's Spain, a few years back with Ferran Adrià at Bouilly, or more recently, the Scandinavian countries in the well-known restaurant in Copenhagen, Noma, all of them have worked in France. They've all trained in France. I mean, they're profoundly, their technique is French. The way they think about food is French. They may be using local produce and creating flavor constellations that are Scandinavian or Spanish, but the logic of the way that they cook is French. And I say the reason that France is still the arbiter is that there is a level of gastronomic literacy in France that is unique in the world. I teach occasionally. I was invited by the mayor of the little village where I spend time in the south of France to come into the school every once in a while and speak English as a native English speaker with the kids at different levels of English. It's something I enjoy doing more than almost anything else. And we end up talking about food. Food and snow, because down there, they're obsessed with the idea of snow because many of them have never seen it. But when we talk about food, I say, well, we've referred to the map on the school, the map on the wall of their classroom. It's a map of France with pictograms of different types of food, because the children learn that the best oysters come from Brittany, that the Alsace is famous for its sausages, or that the Riviera is best known for various different food products, or that cassoulet comes from the Southwest. That they learn this. I mean, this is actually part of the education. So the depth of gastronomic literacy in France is extraordinary. And it's not only academic, it's a passion. It's a national passion, which is why there's so much food television. And people follow chefs the way that we might follow sports figures in the US. Then there's the ferocity of a formal French culinary education. I mean, I have never been in the military, but I would probably be happier becoming a Marine than I would being subjected to a French professional cooking school, because the exactitude of what happens in those kitchens is mind-blowing. I mean, when I've occasionally participated in a class, the instructors don't hold back, bellowing at me, I mean, you're useless, you're a fool. You just made a mess of that shallot. There are right and wrong ways of doing anything. It's so sloppy, so typically American. Be that as it may, yes, there are right and wrong ways of doing everything. And they say you have to learn all the right ways of doing things before you earn the right to become creative, which it runs contrary to all the madness of contemporary American food television, where it's competitive, stress-ridden, and there's a sort of an ersatz plot of off-the-wall creativity. That's not really cooking. I mean, cooking is, you speak to any great chef and they'll say, I'm lucky if I have a really original idea, 6 times a year. The French know that. They prize subtlety, they prize they prize the historicity of their cooking. And finally, aside from gastronomic literacy, an avid public, and the astonishingly well-trained chefs, France has this astonishing produce. I mean, there's an obsession. The only other country in the world that I've been to which is as obsessed with produce is Japan. And the French and the Japanese, there's a huge love affair, both gastronomically and aesthetically, and in always really between France and Japan, because the two countries recognize themselves in each other. The Japanese understand the idea that a poulet de Bresse, or a Bresse chicken, Bresse is a region outside of Lyon, and the chicken are raised according to a very, very specific list of a very precise list of things that you have to feed them milk. It's for a certain period of time. You have to feed them certain types of grain. You can't feed them this, you can't do that. They can only drink water from the region in which they were born. I mean, it sounds crazy if you've never really delved into it. Or I should say, it sounds crazy until you've actually tried some of the chicken. The Japanese understand this. And this cult of good produce and seasonal produce and clean food, no antibiotics, no growth hormones, none of that, is absolutely, again, the French are absolutely obsessed by this, and they're also obsessed with seasonality. don't understand, and this is not meant to be a um, unpleasant remark, but it surprises me to see asparagus on menus in the United States in the middle of the summer. Where I spend time in the south of France, we're surrounded by asparagus fields and vineyards. I am almost positive I can hear the asparagus when they crack the crust, when the fronds first poke up. Everyone in this region, which also produces really good truffles, it's a nice place to live. But we wait eagerly for the asparagus, and it runs from, depending on the year and the rain and everything else, from about late April until mid-June. But nobody would eat asparagus after mid-June because that's when the season ends. And so there's this carousel of pleasures that animates the year. Here, I know that the asparagus comes from Peru, and they force it. They force it in huge irrigated fields next to the Pacific Ocean. And they use a lot of, artificial fertilizers and things to make them grow. But that is why, finally, I think that France is still the rudder of Western culinary tradition and will continue to be so. And the nice thing is, too, for people who think erroneously that French food is too rich, too expensive, and too fussy, as my mother always used to say. Why France? Why not Italy? That's what Mom always said. I love Italian food too, but the French Paris is more than ever the capital of global gastronomy because young chefs from all over the world, most of all Japan, there are probably 10,000 Japanese chefs cooking and cooking French food in Paris because they've done training in French kitchens, but also from Australia and Mexico and America and Australia and all over the place. People come to Paris because it's Mecca, and it's become the place that young culinary talent goes to become validated. They want that challenge, and sort of a if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere attitude. And the city is, I think Paris is a better place to eat today than it's been since any time that I've lived there. As Georgia said, I arrived in 1986. Paris has changed hugely. It's more cosmopolitan. There are new rings, as in rings to a tree. There are new rings of French gastronomy that weren't there when I first moved here. I mean, modern bistro cooking, which is, I think, the most interesting food to eat in Paris right now, along with traditional bistro cooking, the stuff, the traditional bistros, which you see in, things like Emily in Paris, which bears about as much reality to what life is actually like in Paris as, well, I'll just leave that there. But what we love to eat right now in Paris is the contemporary bistro food, and it spins on an axis of sustainability and simplicity, because really good French cooking is often quite simple. That's something that Paul Bocuse said to me once years ago when we were in a market, and he had just bought a whole lot of cep mushrooms, and he said, "What would you do to these, Alec?" And I said, "Well, I don't, how would you cook them?" And I said, "Well, dunno, I think that I would probably not do so much to them, Monsieur Bocuse. I think I might just put a teeny bit of chopped garlic and some parsley and some butter and leave it at that." And he took the toque off of his head and put it on mine, which was a rather wonderful moment. But all of that to say, Paris is a better place to eat today than it's ever been before. I also find that the other carp about France and French food is that it's so expensive. There, I beg to differ. Having been in several big American cities on this trip, Paris is really good value for the money. It's much less expensive than New York, for example, or Boston, or Philadelphia, or other places I've been on this trip. And even better, as I mentioned earlier, if you're thinking about a trip, the vagaries of COVID have us all a little bit doubting about whether or not we should be traveling right now. We all make that choice for ourselves, but it's fun to plan a trip, even if it's not for tomorrow. Do think about Marseille. I've written about Marseille for eater.com. I've written about Marseille for saveur.com. Marseille has been one of my favorite cities for a long time. And it is in Paris, we'll always have Paris, but Marseille is the most gastronomically vital place in France right now. And even talking about it, my mouth is starting to water. But I think maybe I should put a cork in my mouth and see if anybody has any questions.
Well, thank you, Alec. This has been wonderful. And I want to start off with a question. I'm actually, while I'm asking this question, I think I'm going to just ask people to unmute. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that for a second. But the question for you is, the title of your book is My Place at the Table. And what I'd like to hear about is, if you're a critic, particularly if you're well known in Paris these days, what's that like to go out to a restaurant? What happens? People obviously know who you are. So how do you do that?
You can become, who was it? There was some movie star. I think it was Meryl Streep. One of the most exciting nights I've ever had in Paris was in Meryl's. I was invited to the American Embassy, and there was a film festival, and Meryl Streep was the guest. And somebody asked her about that, about how do you have any anonymity? And she said, if you want to, you can always become invisible. I do not hang out with chefs. I still follow the Ruth Reichel rules of restaurant reviewing. Um, I make myself, I'm obviously booked under another name. I go out to dinner with different people. And I always sit facing the wall. So I make myself as anonymous as I possibly can. I mean, sure, occasionally somebody will, come and say, nice to see you. I was hoping you'd come try my new restaurant. But like Tom Sietsma at the Washington Post or any of the other really good food writers, Tejal Rayo in LA for the New York Times, we try to be as assiduously anonymous as possible because we do that for you because we want to have the same experience that you will.
Yeah, so very, very interesting. And another question before we get to the people who want to ask, just one more is, you talked about American food and Sarasota food and in your almost 30 years, 25 years or so of writing about food, where do you see the biggest improvement in American food?
I think I think that the sourcing of American food has never been better. I mean, if I go wandering through the farmer's market in Sarasota, people are very aware of where their food is coming from. And that's why also I'm a huge fan of American supermarkets. French supermarkets are ghastly. I invite you to read my éloge or I wrote a little article about how much I love American food supermarkets on my blog, which is alexanderlobrano.com, because they've evolved so much. I mean, the quality is extraordinary, and you can buy a lot of organic food for very affordable prices. I think that the variety in terms of, I mean, you don't see jicama in French markets. It's a beautiful, beautiful tapestry of foods that's available almost everywhere in the United States right now. And I also do feel that there are messages that are getting through that industrial agriculture has to be called into question, because cheap food, we all like cheap food, but cheap food comes at a cost. And it comes at a cost to our health and to the environment. And better than, without putting on a pointy hat, better to eat meat less often, but to eat meat that is locally sourced and has been, from animals that have been raised in a clean and humane way, like at Grove Ladder Farm in Sarasota, where they raise all kinds of beautiful fowl and organic eggs and other things. So no, I think we're eating better than ever before, Georgia.
Well, That's good. You know, I'm in a part of the world right now in a small town in upstate New York where there aren't many choices. So that's a little bit encouraging though, at least. Also, someone has asked about the COVID, with the pandemic, because there have been so many changes in what's going on with in restaurants because of the pandemic. Number one, how do you think restaurants have handled this in general? And do you think any of these changes are going to be permanent or will really change the restaurant experience?
Well, it's a moving target, really. I mean, because we don't know where this is headed. And, I mean, absolutely breaks my heart coming through Paris on the way over here on this trip. I was in Paris, and we went out for a couple of meals, and we actually happened to have dinner with friends on the terrace of a restaurant the night that restaurants were able to serve real food, open full-fledged again. And to our utter astonishment, TV cameras were, lining the terrace and asking, we were on television because the French president was sitting right behind us, President Macron. And he was talking about how proud he was that his government and the French, accepting the discipline of trying to submit to the strictures of public health, had managed to bring the viral transmission to a level that we could start to live slightly more normally again. I actually think, and it's just the way, this is just what it is. I think this is going to be built into our lives for some time to come. I think that it's going to be very hard in restaurants because I think that it's going to mean that indoor, there's going to be reluctance in a lot of places. I mean, happily in Florida, you can sit outside occasionally. But I mean, if you have a dining room or if it's too hot and it's air conditioned, what do you do? I mean, do you fill it halfway in the hopes that people will feel more comfortable if there's distance between the tables? It's really tough because the economics of the restaurant industry it's impossible. It's very hard to make money in this business. And my heart goes out to the people who are doing this because it's a real challenge. And that's why I also feel, though, that, for the moment, anyway, in Florida, we can go to restaurants. I feel that, everyone has to decide their own threshold for risk. I think that if I go to an indoor restaurant here, I'm masked as I even walk through the dining room. I take the mask up when I'm sitting at the table and enjoying my meal, and then put the mask on if I have to use the toilet or do anything else in the dining room before I leave. I think that it's going to be really challenging, and I'm afraid that a lot of restaurants are not going to make it. And I think restaurants are going to I think we're going to lose a lot of restaurants, and I think we've become spoiled because restaurant dining is actually pretty affordable. We've taken it for granted for a long time, and I think it may go back. I think the price points are going to have to go up for people to stay in business, and I think we will have less choice and pay more money for what's available.
Well, oh, that doesn't sound so good. I'd love to go back to the good old days, I have to say. Is there anybody on the screen? I don't see anyone who's holding up a hand or indicating you'd like to ask a question. If you are, and I'm just not seeing you, just unmute yourself and say, hey, I'd like to ask a question. So who might want to ask something? Anybody or make a comment? I don't think I'm.
Hi, Georgia. It's Andrea.
Yes. Hi, Andrea.
Yes, hi, Alex. Nice to thank you for the program. But I would like to add something. I love reading food articles and food books, and I'm just wondering what current food writers you follow, and are there any kind of real essential food books you think people should read? I read blogs and I read not memoirs of chefs and all kinds of stuff like that. So who do you pay attention to?
Well, I mean, I read so much and so avidly. I mean, one of the things that's interesting now, Andrea, is that I read in I read food critics in Milan, and I read
Oh, yeah.
Berlin, and I read them all over the place. I think one of the great things now, one of the most interesting things that's going on right now is Substack. For people who don't know what Substack is, it's basically a self-publishing platform. And I think that as the idea of a one-size-fits-all magazine has kind of shattered, I think that magazines, we're not living in a time of magazines anymore. And a lot of people are self-publishing. And that's why I think it's interesting to hear you say that you enjoy these blogs, because they have more texture and they have a distinctive style, and they cover a variety of different subjects that are different and more adventurous. They also have what I find often to be the missing link in the most tragically missing in a lot of American food writing, which is a sense of humor. I love reading, for example, the critics in The Guardian, the British newspaper, which is not behind a paywall, guardian.co.uk, because they're hilarious. I mean, some of their restaurants reviews, I highly recommend the critic for the head critic for The Guardian is a guy named Jay Rayner. And he did a takedown of a restaurant at a fancy hotel in London last weekend that had me laughing so hard that when I answered the door to get a package from the FedEx person, he said, "Let me in on the joke." I said, "Come on, if you want to read," I said, "it's a restaurant review. Come in and read and lean over my shoulder. You're welcome to." I think that this could be a golden age for food writing, because we don't have to go through the prism of Condé Nast or the gatekeepers, the big editorial gatekeepers. Now we can do, which is why I've had a blog for a long time, and friends like my friend David Leibovitz, or I read too many blogs. I spend obsessive. I read constantly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I see Peter Joachim. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. He has his hand up. His hand symbol. By the way, there's a hand symbol.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening, Alec. Love the book, and we're also Sarasota residents, but right now we're in Stonington, Connecticut, the state that you describe in the book as old, cold, and ready to scold, which I thought was delightful. I also loved your description of Les Amis de Louis in Paris, having been there, and thought that your description of that was hilarious and absolutely spot on. The question that I have for you is something that's perplexed me both in France and also in the United States, and that's the decline of classic French cuisine. Classic dishes, like rognon à la moutarde, or riz de veau grenobloise, or things you describe, cassoulet, or the restaurant you describe in the book, this marvelous Alsatian restaurant with the chef and the family that take care of you and introduce you to the classic Alsatian dishes. And I'd be really interested in your thoughts on what's happening to that wonderful French culinary tradition that, at least in my experience, I think is increasingly much more difficult to find.
It unfortunately, Peter, and first of all, I would say that I did not, I am very proudly to be of Connecticut. I think Connecticut's a wonderful place, and I got an incredible education in the public schools there. So I did not mean to come down hard on the nutmeg state, or the Constitution state, as we might choose to call it. The public schools, I think, are almost the best in the country, along with Massachusetts. But in any event, what's happened, a couple of things have happened. I mean, the French government decided, as a way of creating more work, because France has a very stubborn unemployment rate. And so there was something that was instituted over 10 years ago now, which was called Les 35 heures, or the 35-hour work week. And that goes across the board. And what that did is it kneecapped the restaurant industry. Because when you're cooking, I mean, you can't have people looking at the clock. And if they're cooking and they stay another 20 minutes because you have to skim the stock, or you have to do this, or whatever it is, and keep the kitchen staffed up all afternoon to create the base of those flavors, which you're referring to, the basis of classical French cooking, it's become almost exorbitantly expensive. And that's why a lot of that classical French cooking is now found under the roofs of luxury hotels because they have deep pockets, corporate owners who see this as a prestigious value-added offers, an amenity that will attract people to the hotel. I think eventually what's happening right now, though, in Paris, and I'm very optimistic about it. I posted on my blog today the seven new restaurants in Paris that you should know about if you're coming anytime soon. One of them is a young guy from the Jura in Eastern France, and he's one of what I call the new regionalists, because French cooking is the story of its regional kitchens. Every region of France has contributed something to the canon of French cooking. And this guy loves where he's from. So the Jura is best known for Gruyere cheese, for Morteau sausage, for Montbéliard sausage. But he cooks with pineapples. I've been in Florida too long. He cooks with pine needles and pine scented honey. I mean, he brings his region to the table in the 16th arrondissement in Paris. With delight and pride. And there are a lot of chefs who are starting to do this. So there's this renaissance of regionalism, French regionalism, with the new generation of cooks. So I'm optimistic about that. I do think, though, I mean, you've probably read about it in the papers. Alain Ducasse's 3-star restaurant at the Plaza Athénée Hotel closed at the end of June. The hotel decided that the Restaurant Alain Ducasse au Plaza Athénée, they closed it and they hired a TV chef, somebody from one of these competitive cooking shows. And when I've talked to a lot of chefs about it, and they said, including the most brilliant chef in Paris right now, who's this almost 7-foot tall Franco-Malian, Franco-African chef, who's a genius actually. And we were talking about it right before I left to come back here. And Maury, his name is Maury Sacco, said, Alec, what's happened is that the restaurant is more important today than ever before. When we go out, that's where we go for everything. We go to eat, but we also go to have a good time. We go to listen to music. We go to meet people. Restaurants can't be static anymore. People need to circulate more. That people of my generation, not mine, but his, want a restaurant to be something other than what it's been so far. And I said, but do you not enjoy going to a great classical restaurant? And he said, well, of course I do. But they will survive in smaller numbers. But the restaurant has been an evolving concept all through, ever since they were created after the French Revolution. And that classical French cooking, this escoffier style cooking, has become a huge luxury. And that's true for traditional bistro cooking too. I mean, the traditional bistro cooking, to extract, I write about this in my book, in that kitchen of that ornery lady of the restaurant in Les Halles, to extract flavor out of the meat of an old cow requires a lot of patience, a lot of time, and
Lebrano? Lebrano.
a lot of genius. So, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that all of that stuff is not going to go away, Peter.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have one last question because I'm afraid we're losing.
Wants a glass of wine.
Alex, I would like a glass of wine.
Of course you do.
I don't have them when I do my Zooms. And we're losing your light a little bit. So it must be sunset where you are. But I have one last question, and that is there any good place, a decent place in Sarasota to get French food? Any restaurants?
Yes, I'm awfully glad you asked that, Georgia, because the Maison Blanche, where I had dinner with some friends the other night,
Yeah, okay.
he worked in Paris. I knew him when he was cooking in Paris, and I don't go often, it's expensive. But friends invited us the other night, and also when I'm here, we're not necessarily looking for French food, but as a special occasion restaurant, his cooking is beautiful. I mean, it is light and flavorful, and he works with gorgeous produce, and the wine list is fantastic. and very fairly priced. And his wife is quite charming. And so, yes, and apparently, I haven't been yet, but apparently there's some new French bakers in Sarasota as well. But yes, for French food, I'd go to the Maison Blanche.
Great. Super. Thank you for that recommendation. I will definitely do that. I've lived there almost 11, 12 years and I haven't been there yet, but I will. Well, I want to thank you so much for being our guest this evening. It has been wonderful. And I want to thank all of you who attended via Zoom. And don't forget that Alex's book is available for sale at bookstore number 1. And I put a link in the chat at the very top of this chat function on this Zoom call if you want to get a direct link to purchase it from us. But thank you, Alec, so much. Hope to see you sometime
Send it to
in
us.
Sarasota.
Absolutely, Georgia. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.